Okay. Tamam. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us here today, both physically and virtually. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marva Akhtar. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature here at Ibn Khaldun University. And thank you for joining us for the second session of today's workshop panel titled Revisiting the Self in the Social Sciences. We have a distinguished panel with us today, and we will be asking the question of what is the self and how should we revise the way we see and understand the self from panelists who will be approaching the topic from the political sciences, international relations, and philosophy, and psychology as well. So, you know, in our keynote, one of our keynote speakers this morning, Professor Alev Arkilet, reminded us how social scientists and scholars of the humanities should always look at three things and constantly consider three things: the assumptions, the concepts, and the methodologies that we're using. So if the first session today, we looked more at the kinds and levels, the maratib of knowledge, right now in our session, we will be looking at a very central concept, the self who is in pursuit of this knowledge and who is also the object of this knowledge. So without further ado, just a few key words about the format of this panel. We have four speakers who will be speaking around 20 minutes each. And at the end of the four talks, we will have a Q&A. And we're set to end around 4 p.m. And of course, if you were on Zoom right now, as we have been for 2 years, I would ask you to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras at this point. But Dr. Epstein, do you hear us? I just want to check.
I do.
Oh,
yes, thank you. Everything's great.
Oh, I'm glad. Okay. So our first speaker, the first speaker panelist will be Dr. Houman Keshawarzi. After that, we will have Dr. Brian Epstein, who will be delivering his talk. Then we have Professor Eric Ringmar. And finally, we have Dr. Hiba Raouf Izzat, who will be concluding our panel. So without further ado, Dr. Houman Keshawarzi is a licensed psychotherapist. He holds a doctorate of clinical psychology, a master's of clinical psychology, and a bachelor's of science, specialist psychology track, minor in Islamic studies. He is currently an assistant professor at Ibn Khaldun University, Istanbul, adjunct professor at American Islamic College, Hartford Seminary, instructor of psychology at Islamic Online University, and founding director of Khalil Center, the first Islamically oriented professional community mental wellness center and largest provider of Muslim mental health care in North America. He is also a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding at the Global Health Center, conducting research on topics related to Muslims and mental health. He is the co-editor of Applying Islamic Principles to Clinical Mental Health Care, Introducing Traditional Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy, and Dr. Keshawarzi will be delivering his panel talk titled Understanding the Underpinnings of the Mainstream Theories of Human Psychology, a Critical Review. Dr. Keshawarzi, the floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. Can we pull up the slideshow for my talk? While you're pulling it up, I'll just start with some introductory words. My talk is a critical review. So Ayaz put me up to the task of speaking on this panel, and he told me to just do a critique of modern psychology. It's like, Hojam, can you just criticize psychology for us, like mainstream psychology? And I said, sure, that's I do that in my sleep, that's sort of that's what I've built my profession around. And so I said, do you want me to assert and talk about the self and plug in, because in Tasawwuf we have this concept of takhliya or tahliya ba'da takhliya. So first you empty the cup of anything that's in it, then you fill it, right? And so he said, no. Just do the takhliya part. The next session we'll do the tahliya. They'll build on the self. I said, okay, no problem, inshallah. Then that's the easier part, actually, just to criticize something. It's easy to be a critic, hard to build something. So, do we have it coming up or? I was just looking for the PowerPoint is. We're still awaiting it coming up. I guess I could kind of get started then without the PowerPoint, and when you guys sort of have it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're doing a critical review of mainstream theories in psychology, and what I'd like to do is to sort of talk a little bit about the brief history of psychology. Psychology is, modern psychology at least, is only about 100 some odd years old. And we had in the early 1900s the birth of the American Psychological Association. And we're going to talk about the problem of monoplexity, so to speak, sort of the opposite of multiplexity, and looking at things through reductionism. It's another way of saying it. So if we can move to the next slide. Next, please. So in the early 1900s, particularly American psychologists wanted to model studying the human psychology after the American Medical Association, so after the medical tradition. So what they wanted to do was to use the tools of medicine in order to be able to study, or the methods of medicine in order to be able to study the human body, which is ultimately a reductionism, the biological medical model. Right? And so what ends up happening is that Stanley G. Hall establishes the American Psychological Association in the early 1900s. And every member of the American Psychological Association at this time is also a member of this other organization called the Society for Psychical Research. Right? And in this particular society, the discussion of metaphysics is very much of interest to the society. It's a big sort of interest area, and it combines them. Stanley G. Hall revokes his membership or cancels his membership with this society, and as do everybody else. Most of everybody who joined the American Psychological Association, once they join American Psychological Association, they sort of abandon this membership, with the exception of a very notable psychologist called William James, who's kind of seen as a founder or big proponent, big name in psychology in the US. And he continues writing books on transcendental psychology and transcendental experiences, which is very fascinating. He has some very interesting work on this. So this methodology attempts to try to provide legitimacy and justification for psychology as a science, as a hard science, and to gain legitimacy in the medical community and to assert themselves as empiricists, that they're empirically backed and that they have hard evidence to be able to back their claims. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here's the problem. The problem is that the gold standard of randomized clinical trials, which for many of you who are not scientists in the room may not necessarily be as familiar with it, it's essentially the staple of being able to assert any sort of intervention as being empirically valid or empirically based. That standard, which without getting into all of the details, works very, very well for the hard science, sciences. There's a lot of controls placed. It emphasizes a lot on the empirical method of observation, trial and error through observation, and a lot of controls are put in place. The problem, though, is that it doesn't do so well when you transfer this methodology to human psychology. If you look at this scheme on the right, that is the diagnoses, psychiatric diagnoses. Psychiatric diagnoses, if you look towards the top, The higher numbers indicate greater predictive power or greater, rather inter-rater reliability. What does inter-rater reliability mean? It means that there's that the closer you get to one, the more agreement there is between psychologists that this patient has this diagnosis. Okay? If you look towards the top, you'll see things that are much more biologically based psychiatric disorders. As you get into what we call psychological disorders, more psychologically based rather, they're all psychological disorders, but psychologically based. So we have this notion of, are they biologically based more so, like schizophrenia and bipolar, or are we talking about depression and anxiety, which is a little bit more psyche based? They start to get really low. Look at 0.2 and 0.21, right? They're very, very small effects. That means, what does this practically mean? This means that if you go to many psychologists or psychiatrists and they get the same patient, oftentimes they're going to have different diagnoses for the same patient across the board. So the agreement between psychiatrists and psychologists on this same patient, on the same diagnosis, will not be found very often in these particular disorders. So what I'm saying to you is that psychologically based disorders, this methodology doesn't fare very well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So ultimately, I'm saying that in the RCT, when we're doing an intervention and we want to see if it's empirically evidence, we need to know what the sickness is. We need to label the sickness that we're treating. But if there's no agreement on what that sickness is, then how can you say that you have evidence that you're treating this sickness? You see, there's a problem there. The other problem, let's just take it for granted, however, and say that, look, we agree this person has depression, this person has anxiety, okay? Let's just, for argument's sake. Then we did an RCT to demonstrate that using CBT or any other methodology you want to call it, many schools, and I'll talk about these schools in a bit, but just any methodology, mainstream methodology, they say to you that I treated this disorder and I prove that it works, that they're less depressed at the end of the day. Well, the problem is that even if you demonstrate by a subjective self-report that I'm now feeling better after this intervention, it does not prove the mechanism of change. So how did they get better? How did they actually get better? So that's a very interesting question. Now, CBT will say it was their thoughts that I changed. EFT will say I changed your emotions. Humanists will say it was my non-judgment, non-directive. Psychoanalysts will say that it was catharsis, right? And it was a relationship. Everybody has a different explanation for the same phenomenon, right? Go to the next slide. I'll show you a concrete illustration of this. So there's a study. They had people who were wronged, who were violated, right? Two groups. One group they gave an intervention to, a forgiveness study, right? This was a forgiveness study. It was a religious intervention. They came in the room, they used religious scripture, and they told them to forgive, right? And for God's sake, forgive this individual. Second group, they brought them in and they said, forgive them, but it was a secular treatment. It had nothing to do with spirituality or God. They were just trying to get them to forgive because forgiveness, data shows, makes people feel better. Both groups were equally effective in reducing the resentment, right, associated with the violation after they forgave. Okay. They followed up with the secular group and they asked them later through qualitative interviews, why did you forgive them? Like, what made you feel better? Here's what they report. 2 out of 3 of the secular group said that the top strategies that I utilized was my own prayer at home. It was my spirituality at home. I asked God for help and support and in forgiving. So it shows that the mechanism that the secular group proved to say that they got better was actually spiritual, right? So this is what I mean by outcome studies. Outcome studies will show, look, I did something and they got better. But at the end of the day, why they got better, that's up for debate. That's a big question, right? We can go to the next slide, please. Give you another, so what have psychologists kind of done about this problem, right? Because they've been largely kind of tossed out of the hard sciences community, or many hard scientists will see psychology as a soft science or a pseudoscience, they'll say, because of these factors. And so let's take the example of panic disorder, for example, right? They'll say that it's a subjective experience of distress. So subjectivity in hard sciences is not allowed, right? In the hard sciences. So panic disorder, you get a panic attack, you go to the hospital. The hospital will clear you. They'll do ECTs, MRIs, blood tests, urine samples, etc., chest x-rays. And then they clear you and they say, you're healthy. There's nothing medically wrong with you. And they let you go. Many hospitals, they'll still let you go. Some of them will say, here, get a psych referral or go talk to a friend or something, but you're healthy, right? But so now we can see that because they don't observe anything to be wrong with the individual. There's no hard data to prove that this person is sick. But are they sick? There's something going on with them, right? It's at the level of subjective analysis. Therefore, modern psychology, what it's done is to rely on the subjective self-report. They've said, look, we have to accept subjective self-report. This is a black box, and we work with this subjectivity, which makes it very difficult to classify as a science. Now, when we go to the next slide. So what I say as a further critique, you've opened the door to subjective experiences, right? You can't turn back. You can't crack that door open and leave it half cracked open. Once you open the door to that experience, what rules out the possibility of saying that I'm going to do a dhikr intervention, I'm going to give dhikr, and then the person is going to report back to me experiences? What rules out the possibility of looking at dreams, right? And examining and working with the dreams, right? Again, we're not talking about the perspective of the kalam. In Islamic tradition, we have different gradings of these things, which is what opens the door to multiplexity, right? Because we have different levels and maratib in which we can engage these sorts of phenomena. As Sheikh Amin was saying in one of our discussions, he was saying, look, the mutakallimin may not consider subjective experience as a source of knowledge. However, the Sufis never ignored any experience. So they have a vehicle and a mechanism and a way of dealing with this, and they call this tajrabah, right? By the experiential trials. So we open this door to this working with the psychological phenomenon. The other question is, if you're saying to me that you're feeling better because you worked with thoughts, well, you're making a leap of faith, right? You're making an assertion. You can't prove it to me that you were working with thoughts. The person just said, I'm feeling better. Is it possible that the reason why they got better at the end of dhikr is because of a metaphysical barakah that has descended upon the heart of this individual? If you can say that there's this non-observed internal process that I report and get from the subjective experience, what rules out the possibility of saying that there was something transcendental actually going on, right? So some people may say, for example, give you the one dua, the dua of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, whenever you experience a difficulty or you see somebody going through a musibah, you say, Alhamdulillahi alladhi afani mimma ibtalaka wa faddalani ala kathirin mimman khalaqa tafdila. Praise be to the one who has given me afiyat, has given me tranquility or ease or comfort in comparison to what you're going through, and has favored me over much of his creation. So some CBT person, and they have, by the way, they have an RCT and they have a Muslim version, and they actually use Quran and Sunnah, non-Muslim, by the way, not Muslims, okay? So they'll say, what will they say? They will say to you, I changed their thinking by utilizing some anecdote from their own tradition. How was it? I said, when I saw this person, I said, Alhamdulillah, made me feel better. And it got me to think about the perspective that Allah has favored me over everyone else. So I'm thinking optimistically. This is true, by the way. It's also true. The words of the Prophet ﷺ are important here. But that's not the only explanation, because we also believe that by virtue of saying this, that there is an effect of the dua, that Allah Ta'ala will actually protect you in through the barakah of this dua, right? So which is it? And so what stops us from being able to make that claim if we've already opened the door to subjective experience? Go to the next slide. How many minutes do I have, by the way? I just want to, I'm sorry, 5 minutes, okay. Another notion, the placebo effect. The placebo effect is incredibly interesting, okay? In medicine, we use the placebo effect in the sciences to discredit an intervention, okay? You give this drug to somebody, you give Tylenol to somebody, and they have less of a headache. You give a sugar pill to somebody, and their headache goes away. And in order for it to pass by FDA standards, it needs to be at least equivalent to the placebo effect. Okay? So for example, for mild depression, antidepressants are equal to the placebo effect. This poses a very interesting question. What is it about human thinking, human belief, that they have the capacity to heal themselves by simply believing or thinking themselves out of a sickness? An incredible phenomenon that's undervalued, the subjective experience. What is it that's so fascinating about the human being that we need to look at in the placebo? Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So another question, dealing with multiplexity. In clinical psychology, if you don't have a clinical psychological disease, you are considered healthy. Now I ask you a question. Let's say you don't have clinical narcissistic personality disorder, okay? You're not dysfunctional. By definition, it's dysfunctional. Let's say it's functional for you. Functional, let's just take, I don't know, a former president of the country that I came from, right? And he actually gains popularity, becomes a president. By this standard, it's actually of service to him. This narcissism is helpful to him. And he's living better than others because he's excelling by the standards of functional health. But can any Muslim or any human being for that matter consider somebody who's an absolute jerk and a narcissist to be a healthy human being? So this shows us the limitations of looking at health and the psyche through a narrow window, right? It creates a lot of complexities when we're dealing with human beings. Let's go to the next slide. So postmodernists, what do? They go to the other extreme. They say, you know what? You're right. We've proven that there's so much subjectivity in psychology. We believe it's all subjective. So we throw out the DSM, the Manual of Disorders. We throw out all of science, and we don't care about science. We establish our own school, and everything is subjective. And we establish subjectivity, and we have humanists that do this, the humanistic school of psychology. Go to the next slide. Again, this reaction. So let's jump to the next slide. Every methodology has implicit assumptions. And I want to make this bold claim. All psychology schools offer us a theology of human nature. Now use that word intentionally. A theology, an unobserved assumption about the human being and human nature that their psychology is built upon. Freud says human beings are evil and that they have animalistic drives. That's the motivation, essential motivation. So what's the cure? Then to make sure that you give them and unlock this repressed tension through cathartic expression in a way that they don't get trouble in society. And then you have like the Freudian revolution, the sexual revolution that is actually sparked by neo-Freudians, right? That say, hey, what about if we just change all of society to allow all of human drives to be acceptable, right? Then we don't have this problem of society putting barriers on human nature. What about behaviors? Behaviorists will say human beings are like machines. They believe you're a blank slate. Watson would say, give me any human being, I will make him a criminal or I will make him a doctor. It doesn't matter the human being. Give me a child and I'll raise him to be that by the principles of reward and punishment. What about the medical model? We're a bunch of wires and neural circuits. Therefore, our psychology is built upon that. What about humanists? They say human beings are born essentially good. And because people judge them, they get sick. And so what does the therapist need to do? I need to stop judging them and accept everything from them and make them feel empowered by this relationship with them. And they believe in postmodernism, so it doesn't matter if I agree with your values or not. I just need to form this relationship and make you feel empowered. You see how they're all built on a notion that is built on their theology of human psychology. And I'm wrapping up. Let's just, I think I have 1 or 2 slides left. Go to the next slide. Just concrete illustration, and then I want to stop here. Go back to the other slide. The problem of differentiating thoughts and mental acts. I'm laying the platform, the road for multiplexity, and hopefully my colleagues in the next session will take this over. What is it that in psychology we have a problem of how do you differentiate belief, right? A mental act from thoughts. Okay, I'll give you an example. Go to the next slide. CBT says that all of our thoughts are rooted in some sort of belief that we have. All passive thoughts that come through your mind, they're all some sort of belief that you have. So they say, change your thinking. And I will help you change your thinking, then you will become healthy. ACT, however, says third wave, and they go against this, and they say, no, it's not all thoughts are not your own. They're just these passive thoughts that go through your mind, and they're not indication of belief. So what do you need to do? You need to just let them pass through your mind and pick up the ones that you like. So they say, ignore your thoughts, or not ignore, let them pass through your system. But CBT says, no, they're all your beliefs, change your thoughts. You see the contradiction. Are my thoughts belief or are they not belief? Right? And this creates problems for people with OCD, for example. I had a sexual thought, oh my God, am I a bad person? Do you see? How do you answer this question? Are you a bad person or not? Where did this thought come from? And this last slide will be my conclusion, the next slide. And this is an example of an Islamic multiplex reconciliation, derived from many scholars. I just created a diagram. Mental processes can be broken down into processes of the heart and processes of the mind. The processes of the heart, for example, are tafakkur, niyya, making resolution, and beliefs, i'tiqadat. My belief is in my heart. If I make a niyya, that's a mental act, right? And Ghazali has this process. He says we have khawatir, thoughts. Then those thoughts turn into a raghba, bitaba, that you get emotion, motivation. And then they turn into a niyyah, then a firm resolution, and then they become an action. He has this thought-action process. But at the level of the heart, you will be responsible. At the level of the heart, this mind, khayal, all these passive things that go through your mind, right? These acts are not acts of the heart. They're rather this noise that is in your mind that is stored from, let's say, watching too much TV, and it's just in your mind. It's just passively going through your mind. And we also believe metaphysics are involved here, like waswasa of shaitan and ilham, for example, thoughts from the angel. So you see a multiplexity in the Islamic tradition in being able to really position this. And if I had time, I would show you how you would use this for treatment, actually. We use this process in the treatment of OCD, and it's very helpful. And this is where I'll conclude. And this is sort of enough. This was just the example of Imam al-Ghazali demonstrating. So I had actually one more slide. Sorry, do I have 1 more minute or no?
Sure.
Okay, last minute, sorry. I just realized I had one last thing to conclude. The last conclusion, where do we go from here, is this is what Susan McDaniel says. By the way, the year after, I was at that conference in which they had the first time ever a panel on Islamic psychology, right? This was the first ever in APA history. And then the next year we had it at APA, American Psychiatric Association. It's very interesting. So Susan McDaniel says, these countries have some of the most advanced civilizations in human history. This is her keynote address. He says, with philosophies that do not always fit with the tenets of Western psychology, All psychology is cross-cultural. It can be challenging to avoid projecting our own values and intentions in science and practice. The commitment is clear to develop a psychology that incorporates Western science and Eastern philosophies. However, not everything is important, is verifiable through the scientific methodology. This is a challenge because some assumptions of Western models, individual mind-body separation, do not fit the Eastern experience. So what I say to us all is that this type of platform is ripe for influencing the international discourse of curiosities in what does Islamic thought, and they're asking, what does Islamic thought by having these panels at the APA say about human psychology? So it's time for us to kind of stop shying away from it and come forward and present our ideas on that level playing field in order to influence the direction of modern discourses in psychology. That's my conclusion. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you, Dr. Keshavarzi. For your talk, I think there will be many topics that will generate interesting questions. And it's really interesting how even with transcendental psychology, the issue is there verifiable empirical evidence? And the question is, what is it about human belief that gives the capacity for healing and transformative change? That is not very possible with an empirical, rational understanding of the self. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Brian Epstein. Brian Epstein is an associate professor of philosophy at Tufts University. He received his PhD in philosophy from Stanford University, his master's in philosophy from Oxford, and AB in philosophy from Princeton. Epstein's research interests include philosophy of social science, metaphysics, and philosophy of language, focusing in particular on social ontology and the nature of social institutions. He is the author of The Ant Trap, Rebuilding the Foundations of the Social Sciences, winner of the 2016 Lakatos Award and the 2016 Joseph B. Gittler Award, as well as many articles in the field, and is currently co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Social Ontology. Dr. Epstein is currently president of the International Social Ontology Society and is on the board of the International Network of Economic Method. Between degree programs, Dr. Epstein worked at a number of technology startups and consulting firms. Dr. Epstein, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, great. Okay, let me try to share my PowerPoint here. Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to be juggling a few windows, so there might be a glitch or two, but I hope this works. So I wanted to start by expressing my appreciation for being included in this conference, and also my regrets for not being able to be there in person. I also wanted to express my appreciation for having the time of my participation moved to this session, so that it's not quite so early in the morning here in Boston. My talk is going to be about social ontology and anti-individualism a little bit more generally, rather than talking specifically about the self. I think it's important to distinguish different sort of notions of individualism. Sometimes when we talk about individualism, we mean a kind of political claim that what's important in the political sphere is the promotion of the individual. Sometimes in certain spheres we're talking about, and like in the very interesting discussion we just heard about individualism as a conception of the self as kind of standing apart from interactions with other people. In my usage of individualism, I'm much more interested in the relation between the social level and the individual and the level of individuals in terms of reductionist social sciences. So I'm going to be focusing my talk today largely on how we can think about various approaches to making the social sciences successful. And in particular, I'll be criticizing a certain kind of individualistic approach, and then talking a little bit about some alternatives to that. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why we should be somewhat skeptical about the successes of the social sciences in explaining social phenomena and for giving us policy guidance. Over the last, well, I was going to say over the last 10 years, but over the last generations, we've seen successions of crises, financial crises, political unpredictability, social upheaval, that social science has not really given us a tremendous amount of guidance to understanding or to understanding what policy implications we have for avoiding these sorts of things. I think there's been in the succession of crises an erosion of confidence in social science, and some people wonder whether it's not just that the world is a turbulent place, but that it's fundamentally unpredictable. And it seems as though there are a couple different alternatives in thinking about how we can understand what's going on in the social and political world. It may just be that the world is so complex that everything that happens is radically contingent, that it almost there's almost no logic whatsoever to the succession of history or of social phenomena. And in that case, we shouldn't expect that social science can give us very much guidance, because science altogether can't give us any guidance. It may alternatively be that actually there are some sorts of social regularities, but that the empirical data that we have or the methodologies that we have for understanding the social world simply aren't up to the task. Either way, there's a kind of warranted skepticism, I think, that one might have about our ability to understand and improve the social world. So that's a kind of pessimistic outlook. I actually think that, on the other hand, there are some grounds for optimism about social science. I think there are lots of options for improving the social sciences. I don't think that we're going to get to the point where we'll have very clear or very reliable policy implications of social science, but I do think that there can be significant improvements in our understanding and explaining how the social world is, or at least how important aspects and institutions in the social world can be improved. Today, I just want to focus on one, which is social ontology, which is the field that I've been focusing on for most of my career. I think that it's in part just an interesting and foundational topic in understanding. Understanding the nature of the social world is in itself interesting. It's kind of a theoretical discipline, but I do think it has important practical applications that I'll allude to as we go on. One thing I also want to note is that in some ways the field has just coalesced as a field in the last 10 or 20 years. If you look at social ontology, like if you do a Google search on social ontology from even 20 years ago, it won't really reflect the kind of discipline that we currently have in mind when we think about what that term means. But in fact, the field, I think, has ancient roots. You can even go back to discussions in pre-Socratic philosophy where they talk about the same kinds of topics that we're interested in. And yet at the same time, I think that it remains underexplored in contemporary philosophy. When I think about social ontology, I think very broadly about questions involving the nature of the social world. What are the questions that social ontologists ask? We ask, well, what are these things? What are the building blocks of the social world? What are crowds? What are things like groups of people working together, like a jazz ensemble? What is a marketplace? What is a corporation? What is a university? Shifting gears a little bit, what is a dollar bill? What is a piece of property? What is a law? Or in recent discussions, people have become very concerned with what is the nature of gender? What is the nature of a racial category? These kinds of questions are the ones that are being addressed kind of and brought together methodologically in this field of social ontology. So part of my aim is to kind of explain and motivate some of the foundational work in social ontology. And the way that I want to do it actually is by starting with what in some ways is an outdated model in social science, but it's still thought of as being very foundational and it's used very widely. And that is a model by James Coleman for social explanation. It's sometimes known as Colemans Boat, which you'll see the reason for in 1 second. And I think that if you see the flaws with this model, then it helps clarify the uses of a better social ontology for understanding the social world. I'm going to start with an example that's so trivial that it seems irrelevant. But one of the nice things about being in philosophy is that we can use these toy examples for illustrations that just help kind of illustrate a point that then can be more applicable in other contexts. So the kind of silly example that I'm going to use is an example of something that happens inside of a corporation. And this is an example from a few years ago where we have some social phenomenon that's happening. And that's a phenomenon happening at the level of a corporation. Amazon, Amazon.com, the large online retailer, was a few years ago under pressure to expand its grocery distribution hubs. That's how it sells, foods and other kinds of groceries. And so they ended up acquiring a grocery store chain called Whole Foods. Okay, now this is not a particularly important moment in social science, but I want to point out that this is an example of something happening at a social level. We're not talking about individual people. We're talking about Amazon, which is a corporation, and then leading to another action by a corporation. So we have things happening at the social level. Now, what the sociologist James Coleman argued was that this is the right way to explain this kind of phenomenon. What we do is we take what's going on at the macro level, and then we explain it in individualistic or micro terms. So if you look at the arrow going from the dot at the top, arrow number 1 going down to the bottom, we see that what you need to do is explain what it means for Amazon to be under pressure in terms of the attitudes of its managers and the actions of the individuals who are employees of Amazon. And then we have the causal explanation taking place across arrow 2. So we explain how the actions and attitudes of individuals at Amazon affect the attitudes and incentives of individuals at Whole Foods, that is the shareholders of Whole Foods. And then in path number 3, we aggregate back up to the macro level. So this is called Coleman's Boat because it vaguely looks like a boat, I guess. And the idea is that you have macro explanations that get translated into micro and then turn into micro explanations and then aggregated back up to macro explanations. Okay, so this is the picture of an individualistic social science, a toy picture of an individualistic social science, where good social explanations are given in terms of individuals. This is individualistic. It's not the most extreme form of individualism. There are even more individualistic pictures, but this is the one I want to focus on in this discussion. Okay, I just want to point out what these arrows in principle are supposed to mean. The horizontal arrows are supposed to be causes. That is, that you have a macro level cause, you have Amazon's features of Amazon, facts at the macro level here, causing features at the macro level involving another social entity. And then at the bottom, you have individualistic levels where you have causes affecting, individualistic causes affecting other individuals at the micro level. Okay. The diagonal arrows are a little bit unclear, actually, in this diagram. And one of the things that some people have observed is it's not obvious what is supposed to be going on with arrows 1 and 3. Are they supposed to be ontological arrows or causal arrows? Is the macro stuff that's happening at Amazon causing individuals at Amazon to have certain attitudes and to take actions, or do they consist of those? Do the social phenomena consist of the individualistic ones? What kind of dependence do these arrows represent? It's not clear in the discussions in Coleman what's supposed to be the case. One of the problems with this kind of analysis is that there is a failure to separate the ontological questions from the causal questions. And one of the things that I've tried to kind of help clarify in thinking about social ontology is that it's very helpful when you're thinking about the building blocks of the social and about explanations in the social to separate the ontological explanations from the causal explanations. The separation can't always be done cleanly, but still it's a useful thing to try to do. The ontological questions are asking, what are these events or social phenomena or social facts? And the causal questions are asking, well, how does the sequence work? What are the relevant causal relations and or mechanisms? One thing that some people have tried to do is to try to square this diagram where they say, well, look, the horizontal arrows are causal arrows, and then the vertical arrows are supposed to be ontological arrows. And it turns out that this is not quite as easy as some people have thought. You can't just say, well, the horizontal arrows is things unfolding over time, for instance, and the macro-micro distinction is a distinction between ontology. And the reason is, and I know I'm going a little bit quickly, hopefully this makes a certain amount of sense. The reason is that the ontological building blocks of social phenomena are often historical. You don't have to have a fact about a social entity that's a fact right now. That doesn't just ontologically depend on what individuals are thinking and doing right now. Those depend on historical facts, and they might even depend on future facts. So you can't just say, oh, the time dimension is the causal dimension, and then there's an ontological separation between the macro and then the building blocks of the macro. That diagram actually, I think, can't be fixed. The diagram can't make sense, and the idea of horizontal and vertical determination, which one sometimes sees in the literature, I think is actually kind of misleading. So this is a task. It's not the only task for trying to kind of prize apart some of these questions in social explanation to make room for improving our social ontology. Another thing that I think is very important is that when we do construct our causal explanations, those are often built, they tacitly depend on how we've already assumed the ontology works. So when you're trying to give causal explanations, a lot of the time you already have an implicit ontology. And I think that's what's going on in the Coleman diagram. And so one of the things that's wrong with this approach to social science is that we haven't started first with the ontology and questioned it and criticized the way that social ontology is implicitly treated in that literature. Okay, and then of course there's a more fundamental problem. And that more fundamental problem is not just the separation of causes and ontology, but the question is, now that we look at the ontology, why would you think that either the building blocks of the macro or that the causal factors that affect macro relations should be individualistic? Why would you think that Amazon ought to be entirely built out of the employees of Amazon? Right? Now, this is a sense in which this toy example can, I think, easily be applied to much broader questions. Any social phenomenon you're interested in, whether you're interested in, the actions of the government of the United States, or whether you're interested in, the decision-making procedures inside of a university, or whether you're thinking about the way that some organization is taking actions. All of these things one might ask a similar question about. Why would you think that the building blocks of these organizations or entities or actions should be simply facts about individual people, right? The model ignores the fact that the building blocks of the social are heterogeneous, that they're kind of constructed in multiple ways. And the model ignores that the causal factors can be very heterogeneous, that even if you have an individual, that the things that cause that individual to do it, what that individual is doing, are not just other people. I mean, the fact is, the actions that I'm taking today, in part, depend on the weather today. They depend on the temperature of the room. They depend on the computer in front of me. You know, these are not individual people that are having causal effects on me. So even if we're only considering my actions, then the causal factors affecting me are not simply going to be other people. Why would you expect that social explanations should be strictly individualistic? Can I ask for a quick time check? How am I doing? Do I have a few more minutes?
I'm just checking. You have 3 more minutes, switching.
Okay. Okay, so let me go through this. Let me just argue a bit for the heterogeneity of ontological factors, of these building blocks. The motivation for investigating social ontology is not just that we have an intrinsic interest in the nature of the social world, but there are lots of applications to model building and explanation. And one of the things I want to point out is that even in other science, even in the natural sciences, people are investing a tremendous amount of energy in questions about what things are, the nature of things. If you think about, say, you know, the people who are interested in genomics, they investigate the study of DNA and the nature of proteins and the nature of these kinds of building blocks. In the social sciences, we don't spend very much attention trying to understand the building blocks of the social. Here's an example of using this simple example that I brought up of how the building blocks are much more heterogeneous than one might think. So if you even think about a particular action, like the action of the Whole Foods stockholder group to approve this acquisition, what are the building blocks of that approval? Well, you might think that it's individual stockholders who are taking individual actions. Person A raises her hand, person B mails in a proxy, you know, and so on. You might think it's just individuals, but that's not quite right. There are a lot of other things. There are facts about who constitutes the Whole Foods stockholders. There are facts about what the ownership stakes are. There are facts about what the voting aggregation procedures are. All of those are part of the ontology of a vote. This thing wouldn't be a vote if it weren't for all of these factors, not just for the individuals raising their hands. Okay. Beyond that, there are also more institutional factors that in turn determine those factors. Like, for instance, you have sales and purchase agreements, the United States Corporate Code. They're on and on. There are multiple levels of determination that are taking place where you can't think about what even looks like a simple aggregate of individual actions. Most of the things that look like aggregates of individual actions are not the aggregates of individual actions. And so you have to get clear on what the real ontology is. And once you understand that, the factors are not homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous that determine almost all social factors. Only then can you say, okay, now we have all these red arrows are supposed to be all the causal effects that interact one another. This is the system that we're trying to understand in social science. We're trying to understand a complex ontology on top of which complex causes are built. And this is why our models tend to be, have to be fairly complicated. Okay, so let me wrap up. Dealing with these kinds of complex structures the complex structures are ubiquitous. It's very misleading to start with a shoddy ontology. It matters that we get the ontology right in order to even make headway in understanding what kinds of explanations could work. I'm not arguing that simple models are bad. Simple models are essential for helping us guide the way that we think about explanation. But I think that what's happened in the social sciences is that we have an incorrect ontology that leads us to choose the same kinds of simple models over and over and over again. And that's what I think we need to struggle against. Okay, now what I've said so far is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to social ontology than I've talked about. there's questions about what I call grounding, what grounds certain kinds of ontological determination. And there are also questions about what I've called anchoring, which is kind of how social categories get set up. And so there are a lot of kind of bigger and layered topics in this. But taking stock, I think that the field of social ontology is very rich. Even kind of going through it this quickly reveals some opportunity in understanding the heterogeneous nature of the social world. It kind of indicates some very concrete projects to pursue and synthesize. And I think that there are far-reaching implications for expanding how we model. Okay, in the last slide, let me just give a quick advertisement for the International Social Ontology Society. The topics that we're trying to bring into this society are broadening. I've been doing a lot of work personally to try to kind of expand and reach out to people who are interested in much more diverse approaches to social ontology than we've seen historically. And so our international organization, I think, is very receptive to new ideas. We have an annual conference. The 2021 conference just occurred, and you can see the talks online at Social Ontology 2021 at this URL. But then there's one next year that I hope some of you will consider coming to. And if you want any more detail, I've added a couple links to my own stuff. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Epstein, for your talk. I think it was an interesting transition from the human individual to the corporate individual. I think if I remember correctly, that in the US, corporations are considered people in the court of law. So it's really interesting, the heterogeneity of social ontology, how individuals are not, we can't reduce individuals to the building blocks of society. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Eric Ringmar. Professor Ringmar is professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Ibn Khaldun University. He graduated from Yale University in 1993 with a PhD in political science. He taught comparative politics at the London School of Economics for 12 years. Between 2007 and 2013, Professor Ringmar lived and worked in China. He is the author of 6 books and some 50 academic articles, and his next book will deal with dance and international politics. Dr. Ringmar, Professor Ringmar, the floor is yours. And of course, I forgot to mention, I apologize. Professor Ringmar's talk is titled Social Subjects in Cognitive Theory and Muslim Practice.
Okay, thank you very much. I was a little bit hesitant to contribute to this conference because I really don't know very much about Islamic thought. But I've been trying to think about the idea of a subject, a person, an individual. What is this consciousness? What is this about? And the last maybe 10 years already, I've been reading a lot on this from cognitive scientists, neuroscience, and also phenomenology. So this is something that have interested me very much, really on a personal level. I want to know who I am and who we are and what's going on, right? What is this thing that happens in our heads? But of course, there's a connection here to social science as well, because the issue is, you know, how correct is the contemporary social science understanding of the subject? And is there something that social science can learn from this cognitive scientific understanding, phenomenological understanding? So this interests me a lot. And so I'm trying to talk about this. I'm also very interested in other cultures, right? Other religions, for example. And there should be a way to be inspired by other ways of thinking about the human subject. They're not the European standardized version. So try to connect these dots in this talk. No power presentation. I've written it up and I have it in front of me. It's kind of boring to read, right? But yeah, I have to start by reading because I've never given this talk before, so I'm afraid of getting lost. Maybe I can improvise as I go along. Let's hope so. So the human subject featured in the social sciences is most clearly defined in relation to action. The human subject is rational, meaning that he or she acts for reasons based on independent exercise of judgment, and you make decisions that are in your interest. The subject gathers information, evaluates and ranks this information, and then chooses the action which maximizes utility. A rational subject is a thinking being deprived of a body. Body plays no role. And he or she exists instead inside their heads, inside their minds. The subject is atomized, solitary, without obvious connections to others. He or she is free because he or she can do what he or she wants, as long as it doesn't conflict with what other social actors are doing. Now, it should be obvious that this is a very bad description. This is not who we are. And the world in which we live is not this world. We are far more irrational, more emotional, more social, more interdependent. And a science which features these kind of subjects will, as a result, misdescribe, misexplain us, and also misdescribe and misexplain the world in which we live. So a better description of who we are would produce a better social science. Social scientists might agree that this is the case. And at the same time, though, it's been very difficult for them to change these descriptions. Economists often argue, for example, that this is a normative ideal. The idea of a rational subject is a normative ideal. And we should use this explanation, although it doesn't describe us well, but we should use it because then we get a standard of what we should be like. And if we don't live up to that standard, then we have something to explain. So there'll be a residual which points to our emotions, our irrationality, our subconscious maybe, and that can be identified if we have this rational ideal. Of course, this is very close to saying what economists also say, which is if there's a choice between a theory of human subjectivity and the real world, it's a real world that's wrong, right? The real world is wrong, so the theory is right. So we must change the real world to fit with the theory. And having said this, of course, there have been many attempts to come up with better descriptions of the human subject. I mean, you can relax the rationality assumption. You can provide the human subject with a body. You can provide them with emotions, with a psychology. And in this way, you can introduce psychological urges, some subconscious drives. This is often understood or described as turns. In the social sciences, you have turns. So there's a behavioral turn in economics, there's an emotional turn in international relations, there's a turn to the body in sociology and so on. Now, despite all this turning in different directions, it's been very difficult to radically rethink the human subject. And in most cases, we end up with the same kind of person, same kind of protagonist, I would say. A few features added, a few features subtracted, but basically the same Western individual. And why is this? Well, obviously, because this is an idea that has very deep historical roots. It goes back to René Descartes, for example, 17th century, who makes this famous distinction between the res cogitans and the res extensa, the thinking matter and the extended matter. And who are we really? We are the thinking matter. And where is the thinking matter? The thinking matter is not in this world. This world is a world of extension. That's not where we are. We are thinkers and we exist somewhere else. So what happens to the body? Well, the body is a kind of machine, right? Well, think about Immanuel Kant, who talks about how the rational mind recreates the world in our representations. So we never have direct access to the world. What we have access to is the way the world is represented in our minds, organized in our rational minds. Or more Kant, right? What is it to be enlightened? Well, to be enlightened is to have liberated yourself from your self-imposed immaturity. It's reason that will liberate us from tradition, from blind obedience to authority. And where does reason come from? It's our own reason. We make our own laws. Now, so this is the historical tradition. This is why it's totally fundamental to European modernity, this understanding of the human subject. And that's why it's basically impossible to get away from. Now, the truth, of course, is we have no idea who we are. There's so many different conceptions, right? But the idea of subjectivity, the idea of consciousness is deeply obscure. We don't even know where we are. I mean, if you open up our heads and you look at what's inside, you come across a lot of gray, gooey stuff, you know? You will not find yourself there. You're not there. So this is a real mystery, and perhaps the last remaining big mystery in a way. So how to proceed here? Well, we need alternatives, or we need other ways to think. And one way to do this is to study this by means of science, by means of cognitive science. And then you can come up with an alternative to the Western conception. Or you can look at other traditions, non-European traditions. And so I'm trying to say a little bit about both of these alternatives. Now, the social sciences emerged at the end of the 19th century, and this happened at the time of European imperialism, colonialism. The two coincide very nicely. And in many ways, the first social science was anthropology. And anthropology was very much developed in relation to this colonial encounter. Europeans wanted to know who these people were that they came across. They wanted to know how to control them, how to rule them, and how to convert them into a European way of thinking. And this is what anthropology helped out with. Anthropology provided the knowledge that was needed. And this is when the subject of the social sciences came to be defined. Europeans defined themselves in relation to the non-European. The non-European was defined in relation to the European. So this is the kind of stuff that Edward Said, of course, has written about. Now, the Europeans found strange people all over the world, right? The world is full of strange people. But the Muslim world featured prominently, and the Ottoman Empire in particular. So Napoleon, when he invaded Egypt in 1799, he brought scientists with him to study the local people. The French did the same in Algeria in the 1830s. And when the French Empire expands in Africa, more and more travelers go there. Some of these travelers were later big social scientists, like Gustave Le Bon wrote a book about Egypt. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a lot about Algeria. And then, of course, the British come, especially after the building of the Suez Canal, 1869, when they have a stake in the Middle East for the first time, and they become obsessed with the future of the Ottoman Empire, known as the Eastern Question, right? What's going on with the Ottomans? Who are the Ottomans? How can we understand these people? And all these travelers come to the Ottoman world, and they write books about it. And this is the kind of material that filters back into European thinking, and the social sciences, anthropology in particular, comes to define the human subject in relation to this colonial other. So a little bit closer look at some of this literature. I'm interested in Christian missionaries. Many of these travelers in the Ottoman Empire were missionaries. They wanted to convert Muslims to become Christians. So how to do this? Well, you have to learn about them, right? You have to figure out who they are. What are they doing? And one thing they're doing, they're praying. They're praying a lot, like 5 times a day at least, right? Too much, you know, if you're a Christian missionary. So the point was to somehow undermine these Muslim religious practices. So if you read these books, the travelers, the missionaries in the 19th century, you come across a lot of descriptions of Muslim prayer. So I'll summarize. I could quote, but it takes too long. So I'll just summarize. what are the Muslims up to? Well, the prayers are very formalistic, first of all. They're carried out without engaging the mind. They're formalistic, they're empty. Many worshippers don't even understand the words that they're reciting because they're doing it in Arabic. And not everyone speaks Arabic. Most Muslims don't, probably. It's mechanical, it's devoid of meaning. It's irrational. Muslim religious practices provide nothing to think about, nothing to understand. They never engage with the reasoning capacity of the believers. There's nothing to judge, nothing to decide. No personal commitment is required. No personal devotion as a result. Religion is not something that human beings try to understand, but it's just a mystery that you can't fathom. Muslim religious practices, prayer, is also about the body. What matters more than anything is the body, not the mind. Outward appearance is much more important than inward truth. Prayer is all about bodily posture, and the body must go through these required movements. The slightest mistake invalidates the prayer. All the movements point to submission. The worshippers fall to the ground. They are like slaves before a master. Another feature is community. So these religious practices are always carried out together with other people in unison at the same time. Friday prayer in a mosque in particular creates a community which is it's very difficult to distinguish individuals from the social whole. And it's all about mood. The architecture of the mosque, the incantations of the muezzin, the prayers themselves instill a mood of solemnity, reverence, awe. And it's this mood that inspires devotion, not rational arguments and not personal faith. So in all these respects, Christianity is a radical opposite of Islam. And as a result, the human subject is also radically different. Or, to be precise, is radically different from Protestant Christianity. Because, as these British Protestant missionaries point out, the Greek church is no good either. And in fact, the Catholic Church is just as bad, right? So the contrast really is between the Eastern religions and Protestant English religion, the Anglican Church, right? So to spell out this contrast, instead of Muslim formalism, the Protestant focus on the content of the beliefs. Prayers are said in the vernacular, they have meaning, everyone understands what they're saying. What form the prayer takes is totally irrelevant. Body postures plays no role. You don't have to move in a certain way. In fact, not very many movements are required at all because everything just happens in your head. So Protestantism is about your mind, right? It's not about your body. Faith must be articulated, but the believers must be able to reason. They must reach judgment, make choices, and the result is a personal faith. Protestantism is a religion of the head. Faith is a mental state. The relation to God is a personal relationship with very little emphasis on the community. You can be a Protestant alone, like Robinson Crusoe, you're on your island, you don't need anyone else. And there's no particular mood, or Protestant services are conducted in a very neutral mood. No smoke and mirrors, you're not trying to kind of induce some kind of holy atmosphere, nothing like that. It's a very rational religion. So the connection here between the Protestant understanding of the subject and the understanding of the subject in the social sciences should be obvious. It's the same. So Protestantism, as a result, is a modern religion. It's a rational religion. It's a religion for contemporary society. Now, of course, this description should be obvious. It's made by missionaries, travelers to the Muslim world. It's deeply prejudiced, incorrect, racist, but let's take it as a true description. That's my suggestion. Let's say that this is true, just for the sake of the argument. Because what we will find in that case is something really interesting. If you go to the cognitive sciences, and you look at how human subjects are described, it's not the same, but it's quite similar to the Protestant description of Muslim subjects. And this I find intriguing, right? So this is another way in which we can find an alternative to the European modern subject. We can investigate it scientifically. I mean, with real science, not stupid social science, real science, right? We look at, physiology and the brain, MRI and PET scans and all these things. Now, in the cognitive sciences, the study of subjectivity, a subject of consciousness, has been taboo for a very long time. We heard earlier about William James. William James was interested in this. But then what comes after William James is the behavioral revolution. And here you're not allowed to think about what people experience, but only what they do, basically. It's about your behavior. So for a very long time, almost 100 years, no one who wants a career, okay, studies subjectivity or consciousness. And people study the brain, but the brain is always studied from a third person's point of view, not a first person's point of view. The brain is an object. It's not something, it's not a way for you to experience the world. There's no notion of the subjective experience. So in this way, this Descartesian, Kantian conception of the self is reaffirmed even by neurological studies. But what's so interesting is maybe the last 20 or so years, there's been a radical transformation, at least among some cognitive scientists. And this has to do with new imaging techniques, new kind of ways to study how the brain actually functions, but also new theoretical approaches. And what's very interesting here is additional philosophy, and in particular phenomenology. Phenomenology is the philosophical study of experiences. And it's impossible to study experiences without studying someone's experiences. Whose experience? Well, mine, and yours, right? So consciousness and subjectivity turns out to be a first-person phenomenon. It's not a third-person phenomenon. And now there are a lot of people who are working on this, and often combining phenomenological philosophy and neuroscience in a very interesting way. So this is a way to undermine the Western modern understanding of the subject. Many things can be said about this, obviously, and I don't have so much time. So again, I'll just summarize. Now, first of all, it's anti-Cartesian. Human beings are not made of two different things. We're not made of thinking matter and extended matter. There's only one thing. There's no qualitative difference between our bodies and our minds. There's no ghost in the machine, right? There's no soul. We are embodied. What we call the mind or what we call the body are just one system. It functions together. Minds are embodied, bodies are minded, if you like. Cognition doesn't happen in your head. Cognition happens throughout your body. We know with our bodies. We imagine with our bodies. We make decisions with our bodies. What am I doing here all the time? I'm talking with my hand. Why? Strange, right? My body is talking, and your bodies are listening. You're kind of scratching your head, or you're kind of falling asleep, right? Our bodies are taking part in this cognition. So there can be no such thing as a brain, like a brain in a vat, brain so suspended in water, That's not a human being. We are not our brains. We need our bodies. And this means that the mind is extended through the body and into the world. We exist outside of our skin in a strange way. We exist in a social situation. We think with things. You think with your hands, or you think with your smartphone. Let me check, right? I don't know, but let me check. So the smartphone is a part of your body-mind system. And if you think about it, so are social institutions. University is a social institution, legal system is a social institution. When we think, we draw on these social institutions, meaning that our mind, our body, the social institution are all integrated into one system. Now, that's not the traditional Western modern understanding of the subject. And we move. Without movement, we will not understand anything. If you don't think that movements are important, sit still for a while and try to understand how much you know about the world. Stare right in front of you. What do you see? I'm seeing a plastic bottle over there. You're very fuzzy to me. If I don't move, I'm not going to see anything, right? I need to move my head. I see a table there. What's on the other side? I have no idea. I only see the front. How can I see the other side? Well, I have to move around. I have to walk around to see. So this is how cognition works. We are thinking, we're perceiving through movement. We're thinking through movement. We are hopping, skipping, and jumping. And these are ways to imagine. They're ways to understand space. They're ways to understand causality. They're ways to understand force, direction. And we do this when we're little kids to begin with. And these, we move around in the world, we explore the world. And this is how we come to make sense of everything. We build our understanding from basic movements. The language comes much, much later. Language is not particularly important. It follows from much more basic engagement with the world. And this is true in general. Our minds are not so much, I mean, most of what happens in our exploration of the world happens outside of our conscious awareness. Our rational faculties are not that important. And we just don't know how we do things. Think about something like walking up a staircase. If you have to think about how to walk up a staircase, it's phenomenally complicated. And if you want to know how complicated it is, you can take a robot and you can make a computer program to make the robot walk up the stairs. You will end up with a lot of code, you know, a lot of code. And when we walk up the stairs, how we do it, well, we just walk up the stairs, right? So there's no processing involved. We're not thinking about this. It's a habitual action. It's something that we do because we know how to do it. And this is another lesson from cognitive science, that explicit judgment, decisions are not that important. Most of the time we engage with the world in a habitual way, in a routine way. We use things instead of analyzing them. Consciousness is a kind of epiphenomenon. Most thoughts are afterthoughts. Instead, what happens is that we're situated in the world. We try to read a mood. We try to understand the mood of a situation. We attune ourselves. We adjust to this mood of a situation. The situation calls us. We walk in the forest, okay? We see a path. And what is the path telling us? It's telling us, walk on me. Or you walk into a room and there's a newly made bed. What does the bed say? Lay down on me. You go into a mosque, and what does the mosque say? Well, the mosque tells you, this is a place of reverence. This is a place of God. This is a holy place. You should be in a certain way. How do we understand this? We understand it immediately, automatically. It's not something we think about. We adjust to the mood of the situation. The mood is calling us, and we respond, we answer. Yeah, just a little bit more, not so much. So now, I'm not saying that the Protestant description of Muslim religious practices and the cognitive science description of the human subject are the same. They're not the same. There are obvious differences. Most obviously, Islam has a God, right? Islam has a creator. Humans have a soul. So they're not identical, but there are many common features. Emphasis on the body, emphasis on postures, emphasis on movements, habitual actions, standard routines, the fluidity between individuals and community, in Muslim practices too, you're never alone. You're engaging with other people. The situation to which you adjust yourself, the situation in which you find yourself is very important. Life is not something that you investigate or judge, but something that you do. Life is an action. Now, as I said, it's very important to take other traditions seriously, and Muslim religious traditions have a lot to teach us about the human subject, and also much to teach the social sciences. And as I said, the social sciences developed their concept of the person in confrontation with the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire. We are like this, and Muslims are very different from us. But if it is the case that there are commonalities between cognitive science and Muslim religious practices, we need to learn more about Muslim religious practices. How can we do this? Well, for us in Europe, we have a lot of Muslim immigrants coming. We have a lot of economic refugees, and we have even more political refugees coming. And we have Muslim calls to prayer everywhere in Europe. These calls are inviting people to engage in religious practices that presuppose a very different conception of the human subject. You hear the Azan, right? This is not a way to proselytize. It's not a way to turn Christians into Muslims, but it's a call for us all to return to ourselves, to return to better, more accurate understanding of who we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ingmar. I hated to interrupt, but it was really fascinating. So actually, it was really cool in the sense that now we return to the history of the rational self and how it's constructed and the primacy of embodied reason, the relationship between the self and action, how it's defined in terms of action and appearance, really, of embodiment. So thank you. I think that will generate a lot of interesting questions. Our last speaker today is Dr. Hibarof Izzet. Dr. Izzet is an assistant professor of political theory and civilization studies at Ibn Khaldun University. She completed her PhD in political theory at Cairo University in 2009 and continues working on comparative political theory, changing maps of citizenship and urban sociology. Dr. Izzet has been a visiting researcher at the Center for Democracy of the University of Westminster in London and at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, a visiting fellow at UC Berkeley, Georgetown, and London School of Economics. Dr. Izzet is widely published in both English and Arabic on subjects related to Islam, women and politics, as well as on citizenship, global democracy, global civil society, and Islamic epistemology. Between 2015 and 2017, she served as the editor of a best-selling translation project, Liquid Modernity series, to make Zygmunt Bauman's works available in Arabic. She also worked on the editorial board of the Oxford Encyclopedia for Islam and Women of Oxford University Press. Her recent publications in Arabic include two titles, The Political Imagination of Islamists and Towards a New Civility. Dr. Izzet's title today is Spaces of the Self on Being and Becoming. The floor is yours, Hoja.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for the organizing committee and all the effort that has been invested in this very interesting conference, workshop. And I think that I will be drawing on what actually was said in the first session. It relates very much to what I'm saying, but also to some of the things that have been said in this session as well. So I've been thinking about the title of the workshop, which is Islamic Thought and its Implications for Social Inquiry. And it gives the impression that we have the Islamic thought and we are looking into the application for the inquiry in social sciences, but actually Islamic thought is in social sciences and we work with both. So, and we are the ones who are taking the classic Islamic thought and the contemporary Islamic thought towards the future. So it's quite complicated because we have the two, we put our feet in the two sort of spaces in a way. And it's a continuous ijtihad, how to make what we understand as Muslims when we think Islamically, how can we make that relevant to social sciences? And it's basically something we do every single day and in every moment, because when you are walking in the street, seeing the different aspects of a cosmopolitan city like Istanbul, or traveling, if there is a possibility for you to travel, if you are dealing with life experience, if you're dealing with Amazon, as in the previous session, you know, we are also the consumers and we are affected by all that. So we keep thinking about what is our position as Muslims toward these phenomena. I was talking to my daughter about Amazon, and she was telling me that Amazon was actually criticized for the way they actually deal with their employees. And in some countries, people couldn't even pee, you know, because they have to fit for 12 hours communication and posting process, very complicated to deliver on time. And the drivers actually could not fulfill a basic sort of biological need. So it was criticized for that. So we are part of that. We boycott and we vote and we do many things. And every single time we do that, yani we do or are supposed to think Islamically and say, is this haram, halal? Is this acceptable, unacceptable? What is my responsibility? Because humans are moral agents, even if they decide to shut this moral sort of sense of being, shut it down, yani. Still, they take that decision and it will have moral consequences and ethical accountability, etc. So I was just thinking about this title. And when I was thinking about space, as Professor Eric Ringmar said, space and time and body and movement cannot be separated from each other. These configurations are very much linked to each other, and hence, when we are taking one variable, it's difficult to take it solely in the analysis. So I will be basically moving between different aspects, but I think that the notion of the space and place is very important. And for a long time, our Islamic thinking has been sort of floating. You know, we are thinking about notions, you know, like the creation of the universe as a moment of the divine will, you know. But then what happened, how it functions, you know, in our thinking, this is like a different track of thinking, but we are thinking about this as al-qudra wal-qayyumiyya, etc. from an Islamic perspective. And then you go to physics, and then you go to astronomy, and then you go and do something else. So the first sentence I wrote is actually very much related to what the Sheikh in the first session mentioned, the scholar, when he said al-maratib wal-marahil. And this actually was the first sentence I wrote for my presentation. So I was very proud, yani, that I hit the same idea in a way. And I also wrote in my presentation the horizontal and the vertical. It's about that when you're talking about al-maratib, and these are not hierarchies, you know, they can change. People can actually, the story of Adam and Ash-Shaytan and Iblis, you know, he was that high, and then eventually he became fi ad-dark al-asfali min an-nar, you know. So it's like, these are not hierarchies and they are not fixed. And hence the ability of the human will and the ability of the divine grace to sort of accept this changing positioning. And also, even when it comes to space and place and time, we also move in spaces. Spaces can have different functions. Even when we're talking, by the way, Professor Eric, the mosque is not a holy place in Islam. The mosque is a place of worship, and any place of worship is in itself respected. So al-ardu ju'ilat masjidan tahuran, in Islam, you can pray anywhere. You don't have to be in the mosque. But if you establish a mosque in order to bring the community together, actually between Fajr and Zuhr, the two prayer times, it can be turned into a football or a basketball yard. You know, we can just wrap the rugs and put them aside, and then kids can play. And then when there is the Zuhr again, we put the rugs and we pray. I mean, there is nothing holy. It's not like, it's not a temple. So this also should be taken into consideration, how the dynamism of not only the individual positioning of him or herself as Muslim or kafir, practicing Muslim or non-practicing Muslim, a person who is moving between different positions, reverting, converting, you know, it's like, these dimensions, sometimes we assume that the Islamic perspective, because we assume from the Christian sort of over-dominant paradigm that there is that fixation in a way. No, actually, there is a degree of mobility in the notions that we are dealing with to a great extent. I've been reflecting about how can we think about the different dimensions of spaces that we deal with in our Islamic perspective. So the first space and place was actually the moment of creation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fil mala'i al-a'la decided that he will create Adam, and then he created Adam and he put the soul in him, نفخنا فيه من روحنا, and then أسجد له الملائكة. He showed the angels that they should sort of practice sujood out of respect, out of obedience to Allah that he created this human being, different from others by the will, the human will, which is something extremely important to always remember, and how it manifests itself in different spaces and moments of time differently, different logics in different circles, etc. The family circle is different from the circle of politics, from the circle of the market and the economy, from the circle of intimacy and love and marriage. It's like friendship relations that are very important as well. And we, all of us, know the different examples that we can draw from the Quran and from the Sunnah and from the Seerah. So I was looking at that moment when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam. One of the most important things actually, علم آدم الأسماء. So he taught Adam the names. And I think that naming is very important. And Professor Eric Ringmar mentioned the notion of language, its importance. So when you're talking about the self, it's not only about the self in time and place, but how the self uses the language to understand and describe time and place. And whether this language is given to the self or they can be taught, and they can, do we have a linguistic fitra? So through which we can give different names, different weight in our life, etc. And I think that this is something extremely important in social sciences, as you mentioned, Professor Eric, and also as was mentioned early in the second presentation, the dimension of language is very important. How we name things, the terms that we sort of the crafting of concepts and of terms, I think it's very important. And I think that it's also related to self-definition. How do we define ourselves in which terms, by which concepts, etc. And the problem with social sciences is that it went so widely sort of stretched itself thin to a great extent, to the extent that most of the terms and concepts we deal with in social sciences actually lost meaning in a way. So we usually now start by saying, this is how I define my concepts and the terms I'm using. I'm drawing on this writer, or I'm sort of modifying the notion by adding this and that. So we start highlighting what we mean by so and so. Trying to escape historically from fixed meanings. So, and it's very strange that the human beings try to escape fixed meanings, but they got trapped into the nation state that is very much depending on fixation of the human body. You know, knowing where you are, tracking you, giving you an ID number, you know, using the technology in order to spot you in COVID. You know, we are fixed by, you know, even when we are mobile, we are watched very carefully where we are going through our sort of these technology. But at the same time, the meaning itself is keeping changing and is becoming very much liquefied. And I think this is very important. We have a very important political theorist called G. Pocock. When he was studying the notion of citizenship, and I wrote my PhD on that notion in liberal thought, he said, we started with a civil political notion of citizenship. And then we shifted in the 50s to an economic notion of citizenship, entitlements, rights, welfare state. And then we shifted to sexual citizenship, and then to global citizenship, and then to corporate citizenship, and then to even giving the robots now a persona, you know. So he said, no, let's go back to the original notion, because it has its own boundaries and limitations. We can work with it. We cannot work with everything. Otherwise, if a term means everything, it means nothing. So I think that the notion of language in social sciences and how we use language to understand and grasp the world and the social life of words and their academic importance and how we relate both, I think this is a very important starting point where Islam is actually has something to say, and Muslim intellectual heritage too, the notions of al-furuq, you know, the differences between different terms and meanings and how we define them and what are the boundaries and the overlaps and how to be aware of them. Otherwise, science would lose its meaning. The second dimension that I think also is very important in our Islamic thought regarding sort of reformation of social sciences is our relation to the ghaib, as mentioned in the first session, and where do we position the human being? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran that He created Banu Adam and then He gave them karama, He gave them dignity, and then وَحَمَلْنَاهُمْ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ وَرَزَقْنَاهُمْ مِنَ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَفَضَّلْنَاهُمْ عَلَى كَثِيرٍ مِّمَّنْ خَلَقْنَا تَفْضِيلًا. So God gave us a specific status, and at the same time, we assumed anthropocentrism. We assume that because we have this takrim, we have this dignity, we have this status, then we must be on top of the sort of ladder of creation in a way, which is not true. Because in the qasas of Al-Quran, and I think that this is very important to look into more than just the ibrah of the early sort of nations and early da'was, etc., but actually also seeing how in that qasas, it's very much told clearly that other creatures in this world actually help us understand the wisdom of the universe. And not only creatures, but even al-jibal, ya jibalu awwibi ma'ahu wat-tayr wa alanna lahu al-hadid. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about how even mountains practice tasbih, they mention Allah. And this is very, and إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ فَأَبَيْنَ أَنْ يَحْمِلْنَهَا وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانِ. So how come that the mountains were there? You know, على السماوات والأرض, okay, creatures in heaven and earth, maybe, and Malaika said, no, we cannot take it, maybe other, creatures, but what do mountains have to do with this story? So it means that we don't know enough about al-zahir wal-batin, al-khafi wal-jali, about the creation, and we are given just hints here and there. We have a mission, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He mentions tafdeel, He made tafdeel, He made sort of darajat between different prophets. It does not mean that one is better than the other. It's just the role. It's a tafdeel of the role, and the understanding of that, I think, is very important. This will bring me to a notion that I think has been, to some extent, not given enough attention in Islamic thought and not given attention most of the time in social sciences, which is the notion of prophethood. And it's very interesting that now we have recently interest in that notion in Jewish political thought. So Michael Walzer, for example, who is a very prominent political theorist, started writing in the last 2 decades about Jewish political thought and the Old Testament and the notions of power, the image of God, etc. But also he wrote about prophethood as social critique. And we recently had Irfan Ahmad writing a book about Islam as critique. It's not only about a religion, and we have our own considerations and our own criticism regarding the notion of religion as in Western thought. It means different things than what we mean by deen in our understanding in Islamic thought. So I think that working more on the notion of prophets and what it means. Ibn Khaldun wrote about the different types of humans and the different minds and how they can grasp the very abstract reality or are only limited to understanding what is visible and what can be sort of physically examined. And in between, we have between the prophets and the lay people, we have the Salihin, Ahl al-Karamat, Ahl al-Salah, the people who come closer. And by looking at the notion of prophethood, actually in some hadith, it was mentioned more than once in the hadith, and you can correct me because you are more knowledgeable, that an-nubuwah is not one bulk. It's either you're a prophet or you're not, there is nothing, An-nubuwah has got different facets, and some people take some facets of nubuwah. This is why al-ulama warathat al-anbiya. And there is a hadith that is talking about that there are different things like al-farasa, that you look into someone's face and you sort of grasp the character, or as-samt al-hasan, which means that prophets were not like neglecting their appearance. On the contrary, they have a samt. They are humble, but they are very sort of respectable. They have this aura, as we say in our modern times, and they are always clean, and you can see that they are different, etc. And to which extent this is important in the notion of leadership, and how this nubuwah is something that we can learn from when we are talking about political power, the image of the people in power, etc. We have 4 concepts in the Quran that sometimes come together and sometimes they are singular in a way. Al-Kitab wal-Hukm wal-Nubuwah wal-Mulk, given to prophets. Prophets were not just people just walking on the street and saying, worship Allah. There was Al-Kitab, which means the word. And Qawlillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, qul wa la taqul. So again, being very strict about naming what it means, so and the content. And then al-hukm, which means actually wisdom. And I will tell you something very interesting about how this relates. If you carry all that knowledge from the Islamic background and then read Western contemporary theory, there are so many bells that will ring, and I will give an example. And then, so hukm is basically judgment. And then al-kitab wal-hukm wal-nubuwah, the mission, okay? And then some prophets also were given al-mulk, which is the political power. Not all of them, some of them. So how can we sort of in social sciences look at these dimensions and try to understand the human condition, what it entails, its different dimensions and its different aspects. And back to the technology that we are struggling with now, the human beings, how do they position themselves, the individual self and the collective self, and how the, again, horizontal and vertical, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, anfusakum, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean anfusakum horizontally, meaning the collective agency, the collective self, us as Muslims, not the individual and each individual? Or does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean anfusikum, la taqtulu anfusakum, inna Allah kana bikum rahima? It means that the different levels of the nafs. So you have the madarij in nafs, or you have the ahwal in nafs, you have an-nafs al-mutma'inna, an-nafs al-lawama, an-nafs al-ammara bis-su', you have, so we have a collection of anfus, if we can say so, in our nafs. It's very multiplex it as well, with the good side, with the bad side, struggling. And then we have an anfus, something that can only be exercised, or a knowledge that can only be gained when you socialize. But there's also knowledge that can only be gained when you become very individualistic, something that our modern times do not allow us to do. This notion of al-uzla is very important. And we have all the Sufi tradition that tells us about that you need every now and then. This is not like the Christian Catholic tradition or Orthodox tradition that you leave the world behind and you go and live in mountains and just pray to Allah till you die. But it means that you have to go back to yourself every now and then. And the importance of that in tarbiyah, in education, even sometimes when someone is responsible and in charge of public responsibilities, they have to be given time to sit with themselves, because this also helps the moral self to, be reminded of what it's all about. It's not about power, it's about achieving specific things, etc. What was going, as I said, and this is the thing that I want to share, if you carry all these notions from the Islamic background as a Muslim in your mind, or as a Muslim intellectual, or as a Muslim scholar, and then you start reading, you find windows of meaning. And I was reading in a very interesting book, which is Carl Schmitt has got a book titled The Nomos of the Earth. And I'm interested in the notion of sunan. And I think that it's an important notion for social sciences, because what we are looking for is the wisdom of the social system, and how we can learn from the sociologic of Islam or specific civilization, society, etc. And he was basically talking about the nomos of the earth in terms of constitutional law. So he was addressing the European law and how it developed, etc., historically. And he's a constitutional legal mind, great mind, even if his political experience has got some, shadows, because he lived during the Nazi regime, and there are some sort of question marks here. But let me explain. After he talked about the nomos of the earth in terms of law and the nation state, etc., he had at the end sort of reflections at the very end of the book, which is a big book. And he said that actually nomos has got as a word, which brings us back to definition of words and putting the names in the right place, has got different dimensions and meanings, including appropriation, distribution, and production. And he's talking from a constitutional law perspective. So here was his attempt to determine from the nomos the basic questions of every social and economic order. So from the constitutional talk about how the law developed, etc., the nation state and the importance of the European laws, etc., and then he wanted to give some insight regarding social and economic orders. And he found out that the origin of the word of nomos has got three meanings. And he took the original word itself linguistically, and he said, just as there is a linguistic relation between the Greek words legein and logos and the German word sprechen, to speak, and Sprache, language. So there is a linguistic relation between the Greek words of nehmen and nomos, nehmen and nomos, and the German words nehmen and Name, which is name. So the nomos, which is the system in the Greek words, it was basically the cosmology, you know, this nomos, and trying to understand the logic of the nomos is related to the notion of naming. This is one thing. And then he said, thus the first meaning of nomos is appropriation. The second meaning is basically distribution and division, okay? And in the German language, it is Urteil. And Urteil means judgment as well. So languages are fascinating. How languages move from one level and layer of meaning, and how then you can see that the nomos means naming, and it also means judgment. So al-kitab and the asma, and then the al-hukm. And then the third level that he is referring to is distribution. And he said the third meaning, nehmen in Greek, is weiden, literally in German, which means pasturage. Ar-rai. وَمَا مِن نَبِيٍّ إِلَّا وَرَعَ الْغَنَمِ. And we have this image in Christian thought about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the pasture and Jesus is our pasture, you know, so it's like this notion of production. And the production can have different meanings. The production in terms of economic production, but it has also a meaning of production of characters, production of meanings, production of moral and ethical aspects of a society, etc. So I'm coming to a close, and I had many other points, but I just wanted to close with one thing, which is in social sciences, we are usually interested in the individual or the collective. Sometimes the collective as the sum of the individual, and sometimes we assume that it's more than just the sum. The society is much more complex in its sort of makeup than just the individual. It's not about mathematics. Yeah. So we're talking about al-fard, and this has got a lot of Islam has got a lot of things to say in the Islamic thought about al-fard, the individual responsibility, but the responsibility of the individual to be part of a jama'ah, to be part of a group, and the relation between both, and the existence of the importance of the human will. At the end of the day, you will be judged on the day of judgment as an individual, but also يوم تدعى كل أمة إلى كتابها. So we have basically two hisab on the day of judgment. One, which is your individual life, which is vertical, and the horizontal, what you did to the society and what you all did together in order to sort of guard the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then al-adad, the number, okay, then different numbers, you'll find a lot of numbers in the Quran. And then al-madad, which is beyond. So al-fard, al-adad, al-madad, madad, which is something that comes like when we talk about jihad, nasrullah subhanahu wa ta'ala, madadun min Allah, fathun min Allah, etc. So there is more than just what we examine physically or what we examine in social sciences by experimentation, etc. There are so many things that we can understand in social sciences when we combine with our knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah. And I think that it goes beyond an Islamization of knowledge. It's a big project, actually, because it will restructure and rename so many things, and it will give different, I mean, maybe we can call them 4 dimensions, the 4D, to a very flat sort of perception of the sciences that are related to social life, which is a very changing life. The section that I could not contribute to is artificial intelligence and the spaces of, you know, placeless places and timeless times, and artificial intelligence and robotics, etc., which is the future. We did a lot of work on that in our conference at Medit. We had a conference in spring, and I think we can build on that as well. It will complete the picture, and we'll go back to the Sunan and our relation to the tools that we invented. And it's last but not least, I was giving a talk to some Syrian students, and we were going through the notion of خلق الله آدم على صورته. In Christian thought, they assume خلق الله آدم على صورته, meaning that Adam looks like God. And this goes along with their perception of that Jesus is son of God, and how they imagine the God, subhanallah, yani. In our understanding, many scholars think that خلق الله آدم على صورته, as he is. So we were not something else. We were created like the way we look. Maybe we were taller, bigger, shorter, but this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. And we created the robotics على صورتنا. So you'll find that robotics looks like human beings. We are happy with artificial intelligence and algorithms, but when we want to create a robot, we created robotics that look like us. And then we will have a new sort of phase of these robotics taking over from us and denying our creation and denying our power over them. And there are so many things that can bring some insights to our understanding of the social relations in times of robotics and artificial intelligence and our relation to machines, but there is no time for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Izzat. I think maybe we can cover that in the Q&A if we can. Unfortunately, we didn't get enough time and it's already past 4 a little bit, but you've brought up 2 central concepts for the study of the self, the human will and naming. And it seems, especially like with naming in the studies of the self throughout history, of course, it has been acknowledged that the 2 central questions that people ask are, who am I? What's my name? What am I? Who am I? And where do I stand? So we talk about where a person stands in life. It is a spatial positioning. And then, of course, now with robotics and with social media and this virtualization, we have the virtual orientation of the human being. So maybe we can get questions on that in the Q&A. Do we have time, Hojam, like at least 10, 15 minutes? Okay, I got the green light. So now the floor is open for questions. If we have any, and I don't know, are there any questions from YouTube?
First, I want to refer to Hiba Hoja. Hiba Hojam, you said, you were going to give an example of how, having all this background knowledge of Quran can, illuminate us when we are reading social sciences. But I think you could not, maybe this whole AI thing was the example, I'm not sure. If it's possible, can you give us the one of these anecdotes that you find that, having all this Quranic knowledge is like how it can benefit us, enrich us? This one is the first. And I want to ask to Brian Epstein, I don't know if you can hear me well. When you were discussing this old model, which is like a little bit outdated now, you said, is something causal or ontological? And then, it just came to my mind that, in this whole Aristotelian ontology, we say, cause of the thing and the ontology of the thing are actually the same. So I don't know if you are somehow familiar with this Aristotelian ontology. I want you to a bit elaborate on this if it's possible. Thank you very much.
I can start I can give you the example from the notion of the Sunan, that how different levels and layers of the universe have got their own sort of internal laws, and how there is an overlap. And this is something we need to look into again by bringing together not only interdisciplinarity in social sciences, but bridging social sciences, علوم الشريعة, the Islamic sciences, and the modern sciences. And this is what actually scholars did before. They had the vision from the 3 aspects. So they have the wahi and ilahiyat, as you call them in Turkish, and then they had social sciences, and they wrote a lot about the society and etc., basically based on sharia and the ahkam. And ahkam, interestingly, it's either you understand human nature and then you understand ahkam al-sharia, or you can understand human nature through ahkam al-sharia. And the example that I give is, for example, al-hudud, because these are very debatable, the penal code, and all that. It's like, for example, the punishment for adultery and sex outside marriage is death. Yani, if you look, as Eric Hoja was saying, why 5 times a day pray? It's like, why for like 11 minutes? You get a punishment of death. I mean, it's not worth it. At the end of the day, it's something very immoral, etc. But death, to that extent, it should alert you to the importance of the family and the oath. You know, the oath, the oath was used twice in the Quran, once for the oath between the individual and his God, you know, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mithaqullah, and the other oath is the oath of marriage. So the punishment is is telling you something about the nature of the human relations and their weight in Sharia, in the eye of Sharia, etc. But the punishment itself, there are so many things that we can say about that it was not applied or that people, oh, it's very difficult to prove, but there is here a meaning that needs to be explored. The second thing is our relation to animals and creatures and birds and other things. And it's very interesting that during Hajj, you have no right to slaughter an animal, for example. I mean, this is the time, the place is haram and the time is haram, you know, so it's haram, both of them. And your relation to the universe around you changes to spaces and to creatures. And then how we, in the Sufi tradition, you have mantiq tayr, you know, and al-hudhud in the Quran, etc. And in Western thought today, I mean, Kimlik, for example, who writes a lot about citizenship, etc., is very interested for 2 decades now about citizenship of animals. You know, how animals should be included in our public sphere and considered to be, you know, gaining more rights. And we don't have any issue. We had this centuries ago. We provided animals with protection. You have no right to slaughter an animal or kill an animal if you're not going to eat it. You know, you don't do this for fun. You don't go, you know, as they do sometimes in other cultures, and you just go, you know, hunting. And for the sake of enjoying, we don't have this. So our relations, etc., I think that they have a different anthropocentric perspective. It's not the Western anthropocentrism. It's rather anthropo-responsibility, not anthropocentrism. And we need to investigate a bit in that. I think we have a lot in the classical Islamic thought about this, but it's scattered here and there, and we need to look into it again. To build a notion of the universe and of our place in this universe in a more complex way. I think Muslims have been focusing too much on either too much on the spiritual or too much on the Shari, legalistic, or too much on the physical, and reconstructing the notion of aql and what are the sources of knowledge, including what you mentioned in the morning. A friend yesterday was telling me that in his family, they had a very old lady living in a remote village. And he said that she used to say, I mean, people here who are brought up in a rational choice perspective might laugh at that, you know, but he used to say that a bird used to go and tell her about the information about the family in the other villages, etc., because she was living very far. In Egypt, I laughed because I said to him, in the Egyptian traditions, when you hear something about someone and he asks you, who told you that? We say the bird, al-asfura. So it's like there are so many things that we used to discredit as Sufi or, you know, spiritual, sometimes even superstitious. You know, but actually there are so many things that we can bring into the human sense of responsibility in this universe, and a lot of moral aspects, let alone how this will affect our understanding of empathy and our understanding of human compassion needed for building trust and the building blocks of culture in a society. This is, I think, it all leads to, يعني أواني مستطرقة, it all leads to each other. I think there is.
Right, shall I respond to the second part of this question?
Please do.
Okay, great. So that's an excellent point and a very good question. So it's absolutely correct. Whether one takes an Aristotelian perspective or not, it's absolutely correct that that certain sorts of objects or kinds are partly constituted by causal factors. So it's absolutely right that causal relations of cause and effect can be part of the ontology of certain sorts of entities. Aristotle, in his investigation into certain sorts of functional kinds, gives some interesting examples. There are even some simpler examples where we can see this phenomenon. But even so, it's important to distinguish the causal factors that are part of the ontology from the causal factors that are not. Like one simple example is the example of a footprint. So a footprint, for instance, you know, for something, think about what it takes for something like a mark on the ground to be a footprint, right? It's not just that it be a mark on the ground that's shaped like a foot, right? The fact that something is a footprint ontologically depends on the fact that it was struck by a foot in the past, right? So there's a causal history of a mark that is part of the ontology of a footprint, right? Now that's a very simple example, simpler than one that Aristotle would use, but there's one, that's an example where causal histories or causal factors are part of the ontology of a footprint, right? There are more complex examples like functional kinds where you might have the histories of how populations were reproduced might be part of the nature of a kind. There are philosophers like Ruth Millikan have discussed this kind of example in detail. But it's an excellent point that the ontology will often involve causal factors. At the same time, it is important to distinguish the causal factors that figure into the ontology from other sorts of causal factors. That is, if you have the rain washing away the footprint, or maybe that's not a great example because that eliminates the footprint. But if you have, the footprint, I look at the footprint and I infer that somebody was there. Those are causal interactions that the footprint has that are not part of the ontology of the footprint itself. So I think that what this argues for is, being sensitive to the complex ways in which we understand the ontological factors that go into, what various kinds of entities are ontologically dependent on. But still, when we're doing the science, there are two separate steps of the inquiry. One is to understand the ontology, potentially involving causal factors. And then there is the causal interactions that this entity can have. Hopefully that helps clarify a little bit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Epstein. Are there any other questions?
Just a humble question to Professor Heba. I was actually thinking about this idea of naming. So it struck me in a way when we think of the very idea of naming, looking at philosophers in 17th or post-16th century from Marx to Kant, and then in postmodern world to Heidegger or to Nietzsche, we see this idea as the other speaker talks about this Freudian idea of theology of human nature. So through naming, a new theology is created. For example, Allama Iqbal talks about Karl Marx. He says, "Neest Paigambar walekin darbagal darat kitab," that Marx was not a prophet, but he had a book with him. So you talked about these four concepts through naming. So I saw this concept of naming through these four concepts and how they evolve a particular kind of being, a particular kind of human nature is evolved by Marx doing with his kitab, is coming up with a book with a notion, and then that creates through these nubuwa, through these nabis, through these messengers, through Kant, through Nietzsche, to Heidegger, that naming, that message is delivered, and then a new kind of hikmah is produced by these messengers, and then a particular kind of system is emerged, that is the nation state. So a new being emerges. While Halak talks about technologies of the self, he talks about this chapter in his Impossible State. So I was just thinking about, do we need to reclaim the idea of naming or rethink about this idea of renaming what we have, what we have misplaced or displaced from its original place? So do we need to re-acknowledge that we have misplaced or displaced the very idea of naming in the modern world? Thank you, Jazakallah.
I think this is a comment, not a question, but on adding to that, names are mawazin, and there is a very strong relation between the name and the mizan. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he sent a revelation, he described it as al-mizan, and he described it as al-kitab, and he described it as an-nur. وَكَذَلِكَ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ Nuran. I mean, it's described in the verses of the Quran as a nur. So these are basically maratib, the Al-Kitab as a book for the reason to look into, Al-Kitab as a spiritual message. When you read it, there is a meaning that goes into your heart, and Al-Kitab as creating the names of the Kitab themselves create meaning, and this meaning takes shapes. forms, you know, when it turns into systems, and these systems recreate relations and etc. So and hence, I mean, of course, they don't believe in the project of the Enlightenment in the Kitab as we believe in it. I mean, the Book of Revelation, but they think that words matter. So go back to the work, for example, of Mannheim on utopia and ideology. It's a very important book, but the other level, which is revelation, is not there. You know, it's like as if ideology was a replacement, we will make a man's made nomos. Okay, so how can we benefit from this, but also make an ijtihad to create a world that is in harmony with the nomos? And this is how we see the different nomoi, you know, yani the different levels in harmony. And once they are not in harmony, you will find that there is a destabilization of peace and harmony in the human self and in human societies. And then the notion of war comes, how to re-establish peace again, etc. And it's basically dialectic in a way.
Thank you. I have a question from Professor Rauf, or any of the presenters. This idea of Islamic social sciences. Okay, my question upon my experience from Iran is that how is the relationship with the state? Because in Iran we have this experience of cultural revolution and a government which is saying that social sciences should be Islamized. And based on that, in the Cultural Revolution times, 3,000, for example, scholars were just kicked out of universities. Still, people like me can't teach in Iran, I mean, because of also political reasons. But I mean, in theory, it can be very interesting. But in practice, if it becomes part of the state ideology, it can be very exclusive also. So how is a relationship with state in your view? Okay, if this is something voluntary, or no, it can be in the curriculum, in the schools, how it set up? Thank you.
I think it's basically revolutionary. So it should keep this revolutionary sense of challenging the status quo in a way. We are not serving, we are serving the deen, we are serving. And once you are dealing with Quran and Sunnah, you are looking into it, and then you come with your own interpretation. 30,000, as the Sheikh said in the morning, 30,000 disagreement about things related to fiqh salah. You know, so it's, of course it can be hijacked, of course. And in some systems, it is easier to hijack. I'm saying it out of like scholarly perspective. I think in the Shia system, because it's hierarchical, you know, it can be hijacked easier. I think that the Sunni perspective is more egalitarian, more democratic in a way. Of course, we had our sultans and our despots and etc., but we don't have this, you know, al-imama, and we have a different notion of al-imama, etc. But it can also be very revolutionary, and we have the examples of the scholars thinking about the sunan in the society and trying to promote what they think is justice and dignity for people. So I understand the political challenges. It's also in itself the idea of Islamization of knowledge. I think it had a time span. It was established when Al-Faruqi introduced the ideas in the 80s, for example, to challenge the fact that we only studied social sciences a la Western schools. I remember at Cairo University, where I come from, in the early 80s, a very prominent professor of political theory called Hamid Rabia introduced some notions of going back to the understanding of our Islamic heritage to grasp the meaning of the state, power, hegemony, etc. And he was attacked by Boutros Ghali, who was a professor in the same department, who later became the head of the UN, you know, because they came from the Francophone background of studying politics with law. And they said, oh, what you're talking about is basically irrelevant. I mean, they didn't see, and this was basically, interestingly, informed by an Arab nationalist spirit. You know, we have to have establish our own. And Hamid Rabi has a very nice sentence. He says, al-wadhifa al-kifahiyya lil-ilm. The progressive, revolutionary, struggling sort of nature of ilm, that it has to stand with on the side of the disempowered, etc. So I think it's not about the ilm and school itself, it's about the carriers of that knowledge, whether they are going to be on which side in the political realm are they going to stand. So, and the same with other ideologies. Yeah, and you look at the Marxist ideology, how it created a communist regime, and how this regime itself smashed all the opposition, etc. And some people still till today consider communism to be a liberation sort of quote unquote theology, yani, or ideology. So we are with that for some time, yani.
Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. It seems the scholars in this room well understood the relationship between the epistemology ontology and its relationship with the institutions that we built. Yani, as Ringmar's nice presentation, it's a certain conception of selves give rise to certain institutions, modernity, or all what you have at hand now in modern world. But when it comes to the multiplexity, the conception of multiplex self, I am confused. And from the morning onwards, Hoca talked about shahadat versus gaib. Eric Hoca talked about it's as if the reason, the conception of reasons towards Kant or Descartes, we are unhappy with this. And then we are left with some conception that exclude reason as we know from them. But actually we are reasonable beings and we still talk here. And we are talking heads in the end of the day. And we are still using our judgments, reasons, and language matters. You cannot just simply think of a world without reason and language now. And of course, we are confused, and I'm not expecting any answer now here. But this is the question, I guess. What kind of conception of self and what kind of institutions we should think of with the conception of self that embraces rüya, for instance, or the things that are not visible, the things that's not verifiable or measured. And all this, and we try to carve out a space for this aspect of self, but it is, and everybody understands something different here. And if you ask this to everyone in this room, everybody will come up with different multiplex conception of self, let's say, or multiplexity.
I think under that you have to understand it in a complex way. And for example, as was mentioned in the morning, the notion of ru'ya, al-ru'a, wal-ahlam, wal-kashf, wal-karamat, etc. We believe in it, and it's believed in all religions, in all mazhabs, that people can see something, in their dream and it happens the following day or something like that. But لا ينبني عليها عمل. You cannot make a law accordingly. You cannot say, well, we are disagreeing on the law of the family, and this morning after Fajr, I had this dream that women should have less or more rights regarding heritage. Nonsense, yani. But it exists, and what does it tell us about the moral and ethical code of a society, for example? So it's about placement, how to position everything in its right place. And this is what the whole point of al-mizan means in the Quran, and also understanding. I think this is one of the problems of the Islamic movement when Islamism became political and became an ideology, that they actually thought that we are Islamizing everything after it has been secularized. No, each and every sphere has got its sub-logic in a way. So when it comes to the society, al-fadl wal-afu, being kind and compassionate and forgiving, etc., is important. When it comes to law, no, actually, you get me my right, and then I might forgive. You pay the fine, and then I might give you the money back and say, "Khalas, I forgive you. Take the money." It was about proving the point of me having rights, and it's more difficult in international relations, etc. So I think it's not a confusion. It's like this is a workshop. So we are thinking, and we might come up with like a complex map, different layers and different variables. It might even become more digital, so that we can see the 4D, perspective of, and how they change, how they relate at different, in times of crisis, in times of peace, war, reconciliation after war, social crisis, COVID, how can we Imagine that, so that also the scholars of Sharia and theology can come and give us some opinion, because we usually ask them questions as if we are giving them the answer that they should give us back. You know, it's like we don't sit and negotiate, etc. And I wouldn't say confusion. I would say a need for reflection. And maybe after more than one workshop, we would come up with like map of topics that we suggest to graduate students to work on. We can come up with like these maps that we can see and open the laptops and see the different variables in different colors to visualize the relation between Sharia law, the urf in the society, the social aspects, you know, the international realm. How can we sort of deal with that? It takes time, because we have been colonialized, not only our land, but our minds for very long. And also at the beginning, like in Islamization of knowledge, it was a reaction. I think that we are post-Islamization of knowledge now. We are post the era of Farouki and the triple IT in America, etc. It was a very important, by the way, I was part of that since I graduated, but it was a very important phase for us to get confidence, to gain confidence that we actually, and we also were motivated to go and read. I had a very interesting kind professor of political science who taught me the same school and the same sort of age of Boutros Ghali, and they wrote the Introduction to Political Science book in Arabic that was taught for years at Cairo University. And once he met me and he said, "What are you working on in your master's?" I said to him, "Women and politics in Islam." And I go back to the Quran and Sunnah and Islamic history and see how women were empowered. And I try to relate this to feminism, offer some criticism, etc. And he looked at me like that and he kept listening. And then at the end said, "Well, I don't understand about Islam and these things. Good luck." You know, he was very kind not to be an obstacle, but this is not the way he was trained. And we took the effort of trying to learn more about our Islam. We studied fiqh, we went back and read Ibn Khaldun and Farabi, Ghazali and others. And I think that now we are on a different martaba. You know, this is a new martaba, a martaba of not feeling defensive, not feeling weak, but at the same time, willing to listen to Western thought that is developing and see where can we engage and where we can engage less.
I'll just add something real quickly to that. I think I was actually just having this discussion with, asking the question to Dr. Rajab at lunch, the parameters of multiplexity, right? And I think the multiplexity affords us a lot of liberty. And this relates to the question of the state as well. Multiplexity gives us a lot of leeway, because having said that, there's also defined parameters in which there are non-negotiables. If we look at the Islamic intellectual heritage, there was a lot of tolerance for dhanniyat, right? A lot of constructions of self even is dhanni in the Islamic tradition. They have different conceptions of the makeup of the human being. And the Quran establishes this itself, right? Min amri rabbi, right? Yas'alunaka 'ani ruh, right? And you haven't been given much except qalila, except very little about this. So that dhanniyat actually is a big rahmah as well. It allows a certain degree of intellectual space for individuals to converse and negotiate. There are parameters, I believe, that are at the level, and this ties into something that Sheikh Amin talks about as well, that are at the level of what he calls functional Islam and like ivory tower Islam. The parameters even widen in intellectual spaces like this. But when an individual gets into society and they start to cause harm by turning all of these, philosophical notions into potential movements or confusion for the functional masses to be able to live their life. I mean, you look at this with anything, right? A decision needs to be made for individuals. Decision needs to be made around economics, political decisions and whatnot. And so there is that dhanni and qat'i actually affords you a lot of leeway, but there are parameters. And we see this in the Islamic intellectual heritage. There's been great tolerance for a lot of negotiation, especially at the academic level, even more so. But on the lay level, there is greater tolerance. And then there's also a layer that's inner and outer. What I mean by inner and outer is value-based decision-making. It's your own commitment and membership to a particular value system. So for example, and ties into citizenship. Me as an American citizen does not have the choice to work outside of the Constitution and the civil liberties that are afforded to me, or restrictions and liabilities. But when I have membership in Islam, which is kind of contrary to the nation state, I have certain parameters, and that is enforced by the state as well, if we're conceiving of a Muslim state. Even within the Muslim state, there's still a negotiated difference between the inner and the outer. What I mean by that is the outer membership. So somebody who's a Christian, for example, which is incredible. If you think about the Islamic tradition, and even look at the Ottomans, their capacity, despite believing in monotheism and tawheed, and that the biggest crime that a person commit is shirk, right? What's a bigger crime than that in Islam? While at the same time, the state protects the houses of worship where shirk is practiced, right? This is incredible. So that leeway is then also extended separately, which again creates this multiplexity, right? To that sort of space, right? But any society has to have these parameters of engagement. Has to have these rules or draw lines of engagement, and they will vary based upon context. So I don't know if that kind of speaks to it as well.
No, it's an interesting question. How members of Muslim tradition should relate to the Western conception of the self.
Which on the microphone's off?
Sorry. Oh, okay. It's an interesting question to ask how members of the Muslim tradition should relate to the Western conception of the self. And the problem here is that the Western conception of the self has been very influential and very powerful, and it's all over the Western tradition. And when you read these descriptions from Protestant missionaries going to the Ottoman Empire, it's so obvious that our conception of the self is good and the Muslim conception is bad. And if you're a Muslim, how should you relate to this? And of course, one instinctive reaction is to say, that description is wrong. We're not like that. We are much better than you think. In fact, we're like you. So what you end up doing is to redefine the Muslim conception along the lines of the Western conception, which I think is a great mistake. And it's a great mistake for two reasons. The Western conception of the self, the rational self, is a fundamental reason for secularism. Because once you have defined the human subject as a rational actor, he's so fragile, and anything can kind of, abolish this person. So you make the self modern, you make it up to date, you make it scientific, and then you might as well forget about religion, So it totally undermines religion. So that's the reason why not to copy a Western conception of the self. The other reason is, if you look at recent developments in cognitive science, you realize this conception is incorrect. This is not who we are. We are not these rational selves. We are embodied self. We exist in situations. We engage with the world in a way that is much better illustrated by Muslim religious practices than this Western conception of the atomized rational self. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Dr. Epstein there? Would he like to contribute? No, I think, did Dr. Epstein log off? If he'd like to contribute? I think so. Okay. If there are no more questions, then I wish you all a wonderful afternoon and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Marwa Hoja, for the moderation. Thank you very much for the technical support. the organizational team.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
See you in Stockholm next time.